This afternoon, Steve, there is so much happening every fortnight that it's hard to choose, but one of the most important things is what is happening in the United States, specifically with regard to the Congress and its approach to abortion, to funding for abortion, both domestic and foreign. And the Congress's unfortunate but rather blatant attack, even on the Hyde Amendment, which for a long time Joe Biden as senator and vice president supported. What's going on there?
Well, what's going on is this is an all-out assault on the pro-life sentiments of pro-life American voters, 75 million of whom at least voted for the pro-life candidate in the last election, and I believe the numbers may have been higher. And certainly when you look at the polls, 2/3 of Americans are fundamentally pro-life in this sense. They do not want the abortion business in the United States funded by US tax dollars. And yet from day one, President Biden, or should I say President Biden-Harris, and his administration have sought to make good on his campaign promises to the abortion lobby, and including, not just bailing out abortion businesses. His budget has $340 million that will go into the coffers of Planned Parenthood and other abortion groups in the United States. And also money now going internationally to international abortion providers like Marie Stopes International of Great Britain and others at the country level around the world. This is an assault on innocent human life. And it's really a no holds barred assault, because you mentioned the Hyde Amendment. The Hyde Amendment says that no US tax dollars shall be used to directly fund abortion. Now, we know that Planned Parenthood gets money from various government accounts, and they claim they use it to pay for, breast cancer examinations and other things. And we know to a certain extent that's just a bookkeeping fraud. But in this case, the money would go directly to pay for abortion, something that 2/3 of Americans are opposed to. But this is par for the course for the Biden administration. I mean, we now have the Biden administration setting up, for goodness sake, a commission to talk about expanding the Supreme Court. Why? Because they want to create instantly, overnight, a pro-abortion majority on the Supreme Court and write Roe v. Wade into settled law forever. So these are deeply unpopular things. The pro-abortion Democrats have a razor-thin majority in the House, and really no majority in the Senate. Kamala Harris has to come over and cast the deciding vote when matters come to a head. But this is really ramming the extreme abortion agenda down the throats of taxpayers to bankroll the abortion industry at home and abroad. And I particularly find it, disconcerting for me, because I was in China 40 years ago when the one-child policy began. I was in the operating room when they were forcibly aborting and sterilizing Chinese women by the millions each year. And I was the first to report that such projects, the one-child policy and everything associated with it, was being supported by the UN Population Fund. Even at that early date, the UN Population Fund had committed $50 million into China's one-child policy, doing things like setting up the computer system that enabled the Chinese government to calculate quotas, allowing how many babies would be born in this province or that county or that city. So, and we were paying for these UN Population Fund projects in China as part of the one-child policy. We were able to get that stopped under the Trump administration. We were able to get funding for abortion cut in the United States to Planned Parenthood and other abortion providers. And we were able to stop the promotion of abortion overseas by passing a wonderful Mexico City policy that forbid US taxpayer dollars from being used to fund or promote or lobby for the legalization of abortion. Now all that is going by the wayside. It's going to be a huge payday for abortion giants like Planned Parenthood and Marie Stopes International. It's going to be it's going to mean greater complicity in human rights abuses around the world, not just in China so much, but in Vietnam, North Korea, other countries that have coercive population control programs. These are programs that Americans, if they were allowed to vote on them, would absolutely reject. And yet they're being forced down the throat of the American taxpayer by the most radically pro-abortion administration in, I think, in American history. So that's where we are right now.
Steve, are you saying, we know what the Chinese are doing with forced abortion with Uyghurs. We know that this forced abortion policy is still in force countrywide. Are you saying that now the Congress is about to seal the deal that would return United States taxpayer funding to China the way we funded WHO funding with China, the way we funded Fauci even sent over hundreds of millions to the Wuhan lab? Is this the same kind of direct funding that you're talking about now?
Yeah, I'm talking about funding for the UN Population Fund, which is involved in coercive population control programs, not just in China, but in North Korea. We've documented it happening in North Korea. The UN Population Fund has a program there. We've documented it happening in Vietnam. We've actually sent investigators to Vietnam in the past to look into the UN Population Fund's collaboration with Vietnam's two-child policy, which involves sterilization and abortion. And in other countries as well, the UN Population Fund has always been ferocious in pushing population control programs on poor developing countries around the world. And once again, American taxpayers are going to be on the hook for part of the budget of the UN Population Fund, which, as far as I'm concerned, is an out of control population control agency that runs roughshod over the rights of families and women. It's not about reproductive health. Health projects don't involve killing people. Health projects don't involve coercing women into accepting a sterilization or an abortion they don't want. Health projects don't involve using women in the developing world as guinea pigs for the development of new forms of sterilization, chemical or surgical. Those aren't health projects at all. And yet those are the kind of programs that the UN Population Fund engages in. This has been an ongoing struggle for almost 4 decades now. And sadly, we have now gone from the most pro-life administration in American history to now the most pro-abortion administration under the leadership of Catholic, I pause here, Catholic Joe Biden, who for years has defended the Hyde Amendment, as you pointed out, and now apparently has abandoned it, has abandoned whatever principles he once had when it came to life and family. And it's a sad, sad thing to see. Well,
we've seen, you discussed years of struggle since over 40 years ago with UNFPA, which is essentially used as a pass-through, a money laundering outfit for the Chinese communists. And that's an old problem, but now we got a new problem with all the business support that is exploding around the United States and the upper echelons of elite businesses and corporations for China. This latest incident in Atlanta with Coca-Cola and Delta Airlines, Delta's been very good to me in Atlanta, but I must say, they aren't being very good to the American taxpayer or to the Chinese. What's going on?
Well, Delta Airlines bills itself now as being the most China-friendly airline in the world. And I certainly think that's true because it goes above and beyond the call of duty to not offend and indeed to placate the Chinese Communist Party, like so many American multinational companies do now. And yet at the same time, it's not afraid to offend at least half the American electorate, more than half the American electorate, simply wants people to be able to vote on the one hand, Chris, but on the other hand, they want the people who vote to be identified as American citizens who are legally registered and legally allowed to vote. Those two goals are not in conflict. Those two goals, I think, are exemplified by the recent bill passed in Georgia, which actually lengthens the amount of time, the days allowed to vote, at the same time that it imposes rather strict ID requirements on voters, and especially for those who try to vote by mail. And we know there have been a lot of problems with voting by mail in the past, and most recently in the November elections. So what are we facing with now? What are we faced with now? We're faced with companies like Coca-Cola, who are so woke that they criticize American policies at every turn and serve, in effect, China's interests. And I really do worry that, in a sense, we're becoming West China, because in China you have a high-tech totalitarian dictatorship where the big firms, Alibaba, for example, China's equivalent to Amazon, Tencent, for example, the equivalent to Twitter, Weibo, the equivalent, another equivalent to Twitter and Facebook. All of these nominally private companies are cooperating with the government of China, the Communist Party, to monitor and control and surveil the Chinese people in real time, and to report to the Chinese government through the censors if they say anything untoward, if they say anything critical of the Chinese government. Well, we see now in this country a kind of coalescence of the same thing, where high-tech, the high-tech rulers of Silicon Valley are now collaborating with so-called progressives in the United States to do the same thing, to surveil and silence Americans whose political views they don't agree with. And where do the supposedly capitalist companies of the United States fall in this struggle? Whose side do they line up on? Well, it may surprise many people, but they may be capitalist countries, but they're no longer discernibly American companies in many respects. They're more concerned about preserving their market share in China and placating the Chinese Communist Party than they are in abiding by American principles of freedom of speech, for example. You have now Coca-Cola with 42 different bottling companies in China. They sell a lot of their syrupy liquid to the Chinese people. They would never deign to criticize the forced abortion, the forced sterilization of the Uyghurs in the far west of China. They would never criticize the re-education camps that have been set up for Christians in China. And in those re-education camps, those secret camps, Christians in China are told they have no other God than Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. Coca-Cola would never criticize the fact that churches in China are being turned into brainwashing centers. And, they call them civilization practice centers for the new era. And what they are is brainwashing centers where Christians are turned supposedly into good, believing, docile members of the Chinese Communist Party. The Coca-Cola and Delta would never dream of criticizing forced organ harvesting, which is happening in China, to the tune of, we estimate the profits at $10 billion a year. Where do the organs come from? Well, they come from imprisoned Buddhists, who are members of the Falun Gong sect, which has been under persecution for 20 years. They come from imprisoned Uyghurs, again, Muslims, mostly in the far west of China, who are being imprisoned in large numbers and executed, in some cases, for their organs. Coca-Cola and Delta and these other companies, Nike would never dare criticize the ongoing destruction of Tibetan culture, one of the world's great cultures, which dates back thousands of years, has its own written language, its own long, lengthy history, its own literature. It's now being killed off in real time. They would never dare criticize the way that Hong Kong's democracy is being strangled. Again, good Catholics, good Christians, like Martin Lee, whom I know, and the leader, the 84-year-old leader of Hong Kong's democracy movement. He's been in the forefront for decades. And Jimmy Lai, another good Catholic, are now facing long prison terms that mean at their age they will probably die in prison. They're martyrs for the faith that they believe in, the faith that tells them they have freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. And they're being imprisoned for demanding that the Chinese Communist Party honor its commitments to Great Britain and to the Hong Kong people. But these woke companies will never criticize that. They'll never criticize the crushing of dissent in China, the lack of freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of movement in China, the lack of free elections. And yet, what do? They criticize their own country for slightly tightening up the requirement to present an ID when you vote. Try getting on a Delta flight without an ID. You're not going anywhere. Try picking up your tickets to a Major League Baseball game that you've ordered in advance online without bringing an ID. You won't get your tickets. You won't be in the stands when the first pitch is thrown.
Well, Steve, it's clear. I went to business school 50 years ago in marketing, and we're all interested in market sector, market identification, market niche. And today it's become much more sophisticated than it was back then before Woodstock. That was 1969. But what happens in business is that when you're focusing on the numbers, which are now so voluminous, you hire out strategic analysts and advisors and entire firms to tell you about the lay of the land of various countries, including our own, so that you alienate as few people as possible while attracting as many people as possible. If that is if that's the formula that is working its way through American business now, something tells me that they are seeing that the United States and our way of life is a diminishing market sector, while this amorphous internationalist enterprise represented by China, but as an economic and not a political partner, is growing. Am I getting that right? Is business really convinced that we're in the past?
For over a century, American businessmen have dreamed of capturing the China market. I've got a book in my library by a gentleman named Carl Crow, written in 1930. The title, 400 Million Customers. That was roughly the population of China at the time. He was dreaming, as a lot of American capitalists were dreaming, of conquering the China market and having 400 million customers. Well, now they dream of 1 billion customers. But you see, what American companies don't understand is this, that I was telling the great Dan Bongino a few days ago on Fox News. What American companies don't understand is that China doesn't have a market in an economic sense. The Chinese economy is a racket. It's a giant Ponzi scheme. It's a racket run by the Chinese Communist Party. That's what makes market decisions in China. The Chinese Communist Party decides if you can do business in China. They decide what kind of market share you're going to be allowed to capture. And they decide when and if you're going to be forced to leave China. So if you want to do business in China, if you want to capture market share, you've got to placate, you've got to do what the Chinese Communist Party tells you to do. And rule number one is you must never, ever criticize the Chinese Communist Party. So that all these human rights abuses that I've been talking about, none of these companies, Delta, Coca-Cola, Nike, any of the other companies that are in China in a big way, would dare mouth a word about the human rights abuses. Why? Because they'd be shut out of the China market as quickly as Xi Jinping could say, shut them down. So that's what's going on inside of China. Now, to a certain extent, you can understand that. But what irritates me, and where I think these companies are going too far, is they have now allowed themselves to become almost extensions of the Chinese Communist Party in terms of foreign policy. They are used by the Chinese Communist Party to advance China's interests in the United States. So we have Coca-Cola joining together with weak and woke politicians, a couple of whom are in the White House right now, and enacting policies to weaken American democracy, to divide us by race and by other artificial intersectional categories, in order to help China achieve its goals, whether they know it or not, of weakening the United States and replacing us as the dominant power on the planet. And that, my friend, is selling your soul to the Chinese communists. And that is where I think that these woke companies should draw the line. But that's where we are. That's where we are today. China, of course, has gotten some of these companies to actually sponsor the Beijing Olympics. Coca-Cola, for example, is a sponsor of the Beijing Olympics. And so the Olympics is supposed to be a celebration of the human spirit, right? It's about the efforts of individual men and women to be the best they can be in every field of human endeavor. The games should always be held in countries where human rights are respected. In China, that spirit is violated every day, and it is a very bad choice for the Winter Olympics of 2022. But you can bet your bottom dollar that Coca-Cola is going to be there as a sponsor, and there are going to be huge ads for Coca-Cola all over the Olympics. In effect, endorsing not just the Olympics, but China itself, endorsing the propaganda charade, the propaganda exercise that will be the Winter Olympics of 2022. Chris, I've lost your sound.
The Olympics is coming up next year, but this year the virus is supposed to be over by 2022, and it doesn't seem that it wants to end. You've got a pretty good read on where the virus came from. More and more people of authority are acknowledging that, even though they knew it, frankly, long ago. But how long do you think they can stretch this out? Because some of the things you've been describing in the last 30 minutes are pretty preposterous, and yet they're happening. So it would be preposterous for this virus to be stretched out without end as well. But is that what's going to happen?
Well, I think this is probably the most politicized pandemic in human history. It's many other things as well, but we have all sorts of people, politicians, and supposed scientists, and the media have all been creating panic for their own ulterior purposes. The media, of course, likes panic because it sells newspapers, it gets you clicks, as we say these days. Some of the scientists seem to have lost their mind because they just like being in the limelight. You know, they've had their 15 minutes of fame, and they want apparently 15 months of fame. They want it to go on forever. But the politicians are the big abusers, I think, of the pandemic, because they have just gloried in the fact of their newfound power. In the name of protecting the public health, they can do everything. They can shut down your business. They can close barbershops. They can prevent you from going to church. They can dictate that you have to wear a mask even if you're alone in your automobile going down the freeway. And certain politicians who go into politics for power, not so much for money, but money is involved as well, just glory in this sort of thing. But people need to know this. New variants are of no concern. The new variants we have are very close to the original China virus. And if you've got immunity to the one, you're going to have immunity to the variants. There's no need to cancel summer holidays. There's no need to limit your 4th of July celebrations with your family, as President Biden told us. We've got herd immunity on the way. Probably half of Americans now have immunity because they've had the virus or they've already had it and developed immunity through their natural God-given immune system. Or other people have had a coronavirus in the past, not the China virus, but close enough to the China virus so that they too have acquired immunity. Then we have the tens of millions of people who've been vaccinated. So we don't have to worry about a third wave. And yet all the headlines are screaming about Michigan, about a third wave here, about a third wave there, about a third lockdown in the UK, about vaccine passports, about certificates, whatever name you want to call them. It'll turn out to be a national ID card, and I'm not sure I want the government to know everything about me all the time, the way they do in China. So we've been instilled with fear the last year, right? From television advertisements, from radio shows, from Dr. Anthony Fauci, who has been all over the map in his advice: wear a mask, don't wear a mask. You need to get vaccinated. You don't need to get vaccinated. We need to shut down flights from China. We don't need to shut down flights from China. Name a position he's taken that he hasn't done a 180 on within a few weeks or a couple of months. So I just think this thing needs to end now, and the only way it's going to end, I think, is by Americans simply standing up and saying, enough is enough. We know now, after a year, the risk of the China virus. We know it can be dangerous for people with pre-existing conditions who are elderly. So those people should take precautions. But as for the rest of us, we need to get on with our lives.
Well, Steve, it seems that every politician, when it comes down to the bare bones, is saying, we're just trying to keep you safe. That's what our governor in Virginia says as he puts one regulation on top of another, and for the past year and a half. The problem is, with regard to China, our politicians don't seem to have been keeping us very safe at all, not only regarding the overtures of our corporations and so on, but Anthony Blinken, our Secretary of State, has virtually collapsed in front of the Chinese offensive. The verbal and diplomatic offensive has been very successful. Who is going to keep us safe from our own politicians who seem to be so ineffective at keeping our country safe?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? We do have elections coming up. We do have efforts in many states to get to the bottom of voter fraud that occurred in Michigan and Arizona and Georgia and other states. We do have efforts to tighten up voter rolls in places like Wisconsin and Michigan. To take, in Pennsylvania, they're taking 21,000 dead people off the voter rolls. I mean, why were 21,000 dead people on the voter rolls to begin with? Did they vote last November? Who knows? We haven't been told. It's been covered up. So without going too far down, that road, because that's a long discussion, we now have people in power, I think, who understand that when 2022 comes around, the results of the election are going to be very different than they were in November of last year. And so having a hold on power now, they're eager to advance their cause as much as possible over the next 2 years. So I would advise people, to get active in politics at their local level. Go to the precinct meetings of your political party. Run for local office. Those are the feeder systems for state and national offices. Be active, because the other side is certainly active. The other side is certainly not letting up, and they certainly won't over the next 2 years. And then we'll have an election in 2022, we'll have an election in 2024, and we will see whether or not America still has a functioning democracy, or whether the progressives who are now in charge, and make no mistake, progressive is just another name for socialist, slightly more appealing, I think, to the ear than socialist. And socialist, of course, is just another name for communist. People who want all power to devolve into the hands of the government, believing that the government can run our lives better than we ourselves can. So these are the people who are in charge right now. I think they're dangerous. They're especially dangerous because they've been able to pile on because of the pandemic. And a lot is at stake. I do fear for the future of my country at this point in time. And there's no foreign adversary that would be more gleeful if the United States were to devolve into a kind of socialist nightmare than the People's Republic of China, which would certainly take advantage of our weakness to seize Taiwan, for example, to aggrandize itself in terms of territory on other points of the compass. And the world will wind up being a much more dangerous place.
Well, there's a lot more to talk about, I know, Steve, and I appreciate your coming on board today. People power starts at the ground floor. That's where we are, and right now it starts a year ahead of us the rest of the country, because Virginia has elections this very fall in the odd numbered year, and it will be a bellwether as to which way we're going. And the lockdowns have done everything they could to keep us from doing exactly what you described with regard to going to meetings, continuing and strengthening our friendships and our communities. So we'll be able to talk about those next time in more depth. But for now, thanks very much for joining us at the Population Research Institute's telecast from Front Royal, Virginia at our headquarters. Steve Mosher, our president, has been our guest. Come back and see us in 2 weeks when we're back with you on the latest news roundup. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Chris. And thanks to everybody.